transportation matters affecting the Shreveport area. But again, I am open and desirous of being able to cover a broad range of subjects this morning, and some of which I think are particularly timely. But as I mentioned, since Kent is the executive director of the North Louisiana Council of Government, that's the group that's made up of Caddo and Bossier, the solo parishes. Collectively, it constitutes what's called the Metropolitan Planning Organization. We are the conduit through much of the planning and funding for regional transportation issues. End up being facilitated as mayor of the city of Shreveport. I sit on the executive council of that, along with Mayor Lowe Walker, the heads of the two parishes, Bill Altimus and Woody Wilson, and several other folks. And we spend a lot of time trying to resolve a number of the issues that are before us from a transportation standpoint. One of the things that's very good news that I think a lot of us are excited about is that we are in the process of completing the construction of I-49 North, that segment of road that will go from I-220 northward up to the Arkansas state line. More good news with that is that the folks up in Arkansas have fully funded in the process of constructing the portion from Doddridge, Arkansas, down to the Louisiana-Arkansas state line, and within the span of the next year and a half to 2 years, the entirety of that particular 30-plus miles of highway will be constructed and open. There's currently about 19 miles of it that are currently open already. As I mentioned, within the next year to 2 years, that complete stretch should be open, and we will have, for the first time in the history of this state, a true north-south interstate system in the state of Louisiana. I'm very pleased also to announce that we have been successful in convincing the folks at the State Department of Transportation to have a larger focus on the aesthetics of our highway system. And so we're in the process right now of working with DOTD, SHRAC, and citizens across this area to try and integrate into the construction of the portion that will go from MLK into 220, that whole interchange, some of the things that are more reminiscent of what you see in highways in the state of Texas and in other places where instead of just cold concrete with no identifying factors, no color, no design, no emblems, we look to have some of those things integrated into at least the urban Shreveport portion of the highway. Now, that being said, one of the big controversies that still continues to resonate throughout this area is the inner city portion. That segment of interstate that some propose between I-220 and Murphy Street, the inner city corridor, as it's commonly referred to. To give you an update in terms of the status of that situation, it is right now in the midst of what's called a Phase 1 environmental. A Phase 1 environmental is the next stage in the potential development of a road or highway system. There are 4 routes currently under consideration that would connect Murphy Street to I-220 for the interstate to go through. There's also the possibility of a no-bill scenario being put forward, which would then call for a 5th route that is now being considered, and that is to use the existing loop system around the city of Shreveport. Now, why is all that important? It's important because that's the way in which you go about determining, 1, whether or not to build a segment of interstate, and 2, if you build it, where you will build it. Now, how does that tie into what's the big controversy right now? Shreveport Housing Authority shut down and moved away folks from Jackson Heights housing development back in 2006. Made a promise and a commitment that we would move you back. They own that land, and from that day forward, they have been working on plans and strategies to bring people back into the core of Allendale, hence the core of our city. They have the right to do that. They own the land. It is properly zoned. They have secured all the proper financing in order to be able to go forward. And from a philosophical standpoint, I believe that our country has a great history when it comes to the interstate corridor system within our state, within our country. Going back in 1956 under the Eisenhower administration, we have done an outstanding job of being able to connect cities all across this country with our interstate system. Eisenhower brought this idea back from Europe, Germany in particular, in World War II, because he saw what the Autobahn did for the quality of the defensive system, the defense of Germany during World War II, and believed that we needed a similar system of highways to be able to move people, move supplies, move troops if necessary throughout the country. And hence the start of the federal interstate system program. Now, great job of connecting cities. That 60+ year history, though, also documents has done a horrible job of protecting the cities themselves. The standard belief was that you take that interstate, once you got to a city, you take it right through what turned out to be the poorest, oftentimes those minority fields, and those areas that were least able to bear that type of construction. And you've seen in places like Shreveport, Greenwood Acres out in the west part of town, those of you who've been around long enough, you've heard of Crosstown, which is not far from where we are right here, and other places like that, that once existed as thriving communities within the core, the inner city portions of cities that no longer exist because of the interstate systems that went through them. I think that we should learn from that almost 60+ years of history, and we should conduct ourselves accordingly. There are many examples across this country where communities have made the decision not only to not run interstate systems through the middle of their inner cities, they've actually removed them. Providence, Rhode Island is a great example of that. They actually moved the highway, reopened the core of the city, and it now has made it a more desirable, more livable, more prosperous place to be. I think we need to learn some of those similar lessons and factor them into what we do here in Shreveport. Now, what's one of the other things that needs to be considered in this situation? There's some who say that as the mayor or the city council, that others should step in and seek to ensure that nothing is built in what could be one of the potential pathways for the inner city corridor. Well, there's several problems with that. One of the things that's also been learned from the history of interstate systems is they're good old boys who've been in politics and government, chambers of commerce and what have you, who work to line up where it is that roads would go. And they would go and they would identify where they thought the road was going to go. Goes back even to the railroad days as well, so it's nothing that's new. And those folks would buy up, control, option, often without full information being revealed to the sellers, the actual path that a road would go. So they go in, they buy it low or buy it cheap, and then by the time the information made it out to the general public, it was time for the road to go forward, that they could elevate the prices and sell it for much, much more than it otherwise could have been acquired for. And so that's called predetermining where a road could ultimately end up going. Federal government doesn't allow you to be able to do that, and you've even had a recent example here in North Louisiana with the folks over in Bossier when they did the Benton Road overpass to that little loop that comes off of Benton Road, goes over the railroad tracks, so they can miss all the train traffic that used to block you there in front of the Bossier Civic Center and City Hall complex. They made the unfortunate mistake of pre-acquiring the land where they wanted the overpass to go. When they did that, the federal government said, no, if you do that, you will have to build it entirely on your own. And so there ended up being no federal dollars being available to be infused into that particular project. And Bossier paid the price of the entirety of that construction on their own. And so any act that would constitute an effort to predetermine the path of a road system before you have completed all of the actual processes that are presently underway to determine where that road system would go would end up resulting, if there was a desire to ultimately build a road system, and possibly those pathways being disqualified, and the state and the local region being responsible for 100% of the construction expense. Now, why is that even a larger problem now in the face of the challenges that we have in this country when it comes to building road systems? Well, when the federal interstate system started back in 1956, you had a funding ratio that was agreed upon at that point in time that the federal government would pay 80% of the funding, and the local and the state would pick up the balance, which was 20%. And that's the way you built Interstate 20, I-49, and all the other interstate systems across this country. The unfortunate reality is because of a great deal of the dysfunction that's happening right now in Washington, D.C., that formula has been turned on its head. In fact, I can remember and having Kent Rogers come and to give a briefing before the city council about the status of the inner city corridor so that everybody was on the same page and we were all sharing information at the same time. I said to Kent, I want you to give us an update on what the funding ratio is right now for I-49 North. My assumption was that that ratio was 60-40, with the 60% being the federal government and the 40% being the state and the local. Well, in fact, it was 60% or is 60%, except the 60% is not the federal government, despite the fact that the biggest chunk of that $687 million worth of funding came as one $200 million earmark by former Congressman Jim McQuarrie. That funding ratio for that $687 million, for the 33 miles of highway from I-220 to the Arkansas-Louisiana state line, is 60-40, but it's the state of Louisiana and us locals who are paying the 60%. Only 40% of that is being paid for by the federal government. So if we have a belief that we're going to be able to elevate, advance, and lift and move forward any future highway construction projects in this city, in this region, and do so where the city or the state or the parish or whomever ends up being responsible for 60% of the funding, or even 100% of the funding if we do it the wrong way, then we've got some real serious challenges ahead of us. And so it's very important that for whatever progress or advancement or movement that we see with regard to this project or any other, that we keep it in a process and within a time frame that is in line with what the federal government would have us to do. Otherwise, we could end up being responsible for trying to foot 100% of the bill. More important to that, from my perspective, because any scenario that would talk about going through the inner city is decades away from that. I'm a 48-year-old man right now. Any chance if you're going to end up seeing the construction of the inner city portion of I-49 through the inner city, even if it is approved, would take years and years and years. You've seen how long it's taken us to come up with the funding. I was on the very first I-49 North Funding Task Force appointed by Governor Mike Foster back in 1997, my first term as a member of the Louisiana State Legislature. Here we are right now, 15 plus years later, and we're still just getting the funding in place and the construction is still underway. And so you've got even a bigger hurdle and bigger challenge when it comes to that inner city portion. Now, why is that important? Because what it would ask us to do is to wait all of those years on what should be a strategy focused on how it is that we go about reclaiming the core of this city. Shreveport Caddo Master Plan that was adopted by the City Council and the Caddo Parish Commission in 2011 talks about reinvesting in those areas inside the loop. Those areas of our city that already have streets, that already have water, that already have sewer. And how it is that we should try and develop our city in a smarter, more compact fashion. To construct that interstate system through the middle of Shreveport would give us a wall that would essentially separate downtown from Allendale, Lakeside, and the rest of the western portion of the city of Shreveport. And if you believe that that ends up being an environment that's going to be warm and open and supportive of facilitating development, then I would suggest that you go and take a look at lots of other cities across this country and see what those interstate systems have done for those. You also have a situation that right now there will only be one interchange on any segment of an interstate system that is built through the inner city of Shreveport. That interchange will either be at Caddo and Ford, and will end up being a very odd construction, taking up a lot of land that doesn't lend itself to a lot of commerce in terms of people getting in and off. That's the only way in which you end up seeing real opportunity from an interstate is getting people off of it to come down and do business. So it'll either be an interchange at that location, or there would be an interchange at North Hearn. Now, the interchange at North Hearn would absolutely do the neighborhood of Allendale and Lakeside and Ledbetter Heights no good. Probably wouldn't do the city of Shreveport much good, nor Shreveport, because there's nobody who lives in and around the North Hearn area of our community as well. And so I think that there is a great deal of information that has been bandied back and forth around the city over the last several years about exactly what the potential economic impact could be of the construction of that inner city portion. I don't think that that in any way outweighs the potential that we have in terms of being able to bring back people to Allendale, to Ledbetter Heights, to Lakeside, communities that right now exist, that have a history, that have a potential, and they present us with an opportunity to be able to grow the city in a very smart and effective fashion. Now, there's a parallel transportation issue that has been out there as well for a significant period of time, and that is the extension of Louisiana 3132. That's one that you all have seen quite a bit of money and the resources put behind in terms of trying to convince you of some things that simply don't line up with the facts. I'll give you the origins of it. You have a fellow by the name of Tim Larkin, a developer who is also a member of the Bossier City Council. Tim has built some of the best subdivisions in North Louisiana. He is desirous of building homes on the south side of Flournoy Lucas that range in price from $500,000 to $5 million. The one thing that you have a responsibility for doing as a mayor is to listen to folks who tell you that they have a plan to build homes in your city in that price range. Because just as we want to focus on trying to bring people back to the inner city, the core of our city, our older, more traditional neighborhoods, we also need to continue to take advantage of those high growth areas like Southeast Shreveport. That's our area here in Shreveport. It's North Bossier across the river. And so when you end up being able to help facilitate that type of an opportunity, I believe it's a proper thing to do, especially if it can be done in a way that is in line with any other potential objectives or considerations that may be out there. And so as mayor of the city of Shreveport, we stepped up, reached out, and worked with Mr. Larkin to help facilitate his development, while at the same time advancing a potential scenario for the extension of Louisiana 3132, which right now dead ends at Flournoy Lucas. Now, there are some folks who believe that the extension of Louisiana 3132 should simply go across Flournoy Lucas, go just a little bit south, and then stub back off onto Louisiana 1. So essentially you end up not making effective use of a 5-lane, state-of-the-art, newly constructed highway that the Louisiana Department of the Transportation has said without hesitation has the capacity to facilitate all of the traffic needs for that particular area for at least the next 25 to 50 years. Now, I, for one, don't believe that it makes any sense to just simply go across Flournoy Lucas and then stub back onto Louisiana 1 when you presently have that new road system in place. There are some folks who have stated that what it means is that we're going to have all kinds of carnage, wrecks, and all kinds of things right there along Flournoy Lucas, and that it's going to be unsafe and things will just simply be horrendous. Well, let me give you some actual facts. Since that particular stretch of road has been completely open, since it has moved entirely away from being under construction to being completely open, all barricades down, the wreck and accident ratio between the stretch of Flournoy Lucas that matches up with the stretch of Burt Coombs just north of it, parallel road systems, the ratio is about 5 to 6 to 1. You have 5 to 6 accidents on Burt Coombs for every 1 accident that you have on Flournoy Lucas. It's a clear indication that the traffic flows right now are manageable, that the accident levels are low, and that the question of whether or not you need to extend an interstate system or a road system simply over the highway to get back out to Highway 1 so supposedly lots of heavy truck traffic can get on down to the port is one that I think has lots of holes in it. Now, there is a potential scenario where you may want to extend Louisiana 3132 across Flournoy Lucas and extend it down southward to a point that may one day end up connecting with I-69. That potentially could make sense. Would be a part of a potential loop system that could go around both Shreveport and Bossier City. Again, that is a situation that at 48 years old, I'm not sure if I'll live long enough to see it develop, especially when I look at the level of dysfunction that exists right now in Washington, D.C. with regard to our efforts to fund infrastructure improvements. Much less when you talk about building a new highway. We don't even right now in this country have a real commitment, a real will to maintain the present infrastructure around us. Had Secretary Fox, new Secretary of Transportation at the federal level, former mayor of Charlotte, who has just sent up to the Congress a new transportation bill. He was here several weeks ago touring the country. Shreveport was his next to the last stop. trying to help America develop an understanding for the fact that these systems that we have, this infrastructure that we have inherited, these road systems, these bridges, these levees, will not take care of themselves. That if we expect to be able to continue to have a world-class infrastructure here in this country, that we're going to have to figure out an effective strategy, first to maintain it, and then how it is that we go about investing in those improvements that we all want to see. So again, I-69 scenario is one where the extension of 3132 could at some point make sense. That again is decades potentially away from becoming reality. In the meantime, you still have, as I said, folks who are interested in constructing $500,000, $1 million, $2 million, $3 million, $4 million, $5 million homes inside the city limits of Shreveport. A place that some folks say folks don't want to be. Well, if I've got folks who want to build a $5 million home in this city, I want them to be here. Now, why is that? Because when that person builds that home, obviously we get the property taxes that comes from that increased valuation. When that person builds that home, we also get the taxes from the construction of that home. We also know that folks who live in homes of that level and that value have shopping habits where they buy expensive cars. They buy nice motorhomes and other types of toys and what have you. That person ends up having a Shreveport address when they go to purchase and register that particular item. That those sales tax dollars come to the coffers of the city of Shreveport. So all of those things end up being positives for the city of Shreveport. Also, as it has been proposed, the possibility of being able to extend 3132 is still in line and compatible with the development of Mr. Larkin's subdivision. Now, you also run into the potential problem that I referenced with regard to the inner city corridor as well. And that is that if you go about trying to predetermine a route for extension of 3132, and you have a desire and expectation that the federal government will come in and fund it in the same way in which it has helped to fund other interstate projects, then you run into that same predetermination problem that Bossier ran into. And so that is a process that needs to go forward. Now, what's the problem right now? We have done the phase 0 for the extension of Louisiana 3132. Also, the Metropolitan Planning Organization selected a firm, Burke Kleinpeter, to do the phase 1 for the extension of Louisiana 3132. Unfortunately, lawsuits were filed by the Finish 3132 Coalition. We, City of Shreveport, NL Cobb, all parties involved, have won every lawsuit at the district court level, at the federal court level, but every time we win, the folks end up just simply appealing or filing another lawsuit. In fact, the agency, the firm, Burke Kleinpeter, that was selected by the Metropolitan Planning Organization to do the phase 1, the same process that's underway right now for the inner city portion of I-49 that could potentially go to the city of Shreveport. Those folks are also sued in each one of these efforts. They have reported to us that they have exhausted through legal fees any potential profit that they might have been able to make for conducting that phase 1 environmental study. And so now they have rescinded their offer to perform that work. And so the process again is at a standstill. And so the very folks who have said that they want to see 3132 finished are the very ones through their lawsuits, again, every one of which they've lost. Cost the city of Shreveport almost $200,000 in legal fees, a whole lot more than the dog park legal fees. Cost the North Louisiana Council of Governments almost $200,000 in legal fees. And so you're talking about to us, the taxpayers, somewhere approaching $500,000 in terms of legal fees in dealing with and defending ourselves against what are essentially frivolous lawsuits. Now, those same lawsuits have now been moved from Caddo District Court, for those that have been filed at the state level, to the 19th District Court in Baton Rouge, because it is the proper court of jurisdiction for any lawsuits that are filed against the State Department of Transportation, because those lawsuits named State DOTD, the city of Shreveport, the parish of Caddo, I believe Bossier Parish as well. I know it named the North Louisiana Council of Governments also. But again, an example of when you have a group of folks who apparently have a considerable sum of money, who have a desire to pursue and advance a particular agenda, and continue to do so despite what the courts repeatedly tell them. So that process is one that is essentially at a standstill right now. Mr. Larkin, in an effort to advance his project, has made an appeal to the Metropolitan Planning Commission to have his lot subdivided in a particular way. That particular request was denied by the MPC. I think that there was some degree of political influence exercised at that level. It has been appealed to the City Council. If it ends up either being upheld or reversed, either way, it'll probably end up at the district court level. But again, we end up with the same situation where if the council decides potentially to deny Mr. Larkin his free and legal use of his property based upon the potential for the development of an interstate system, a road system through his property, then we will be, one, engaging in that predetermination process that I made reference to earlier, which one could negate us from being able to receive federal funding. Number two, we could also end up being construed as having denied Mr. Larkin of the free and legal use of his property in a way that he believes to be appropriate based upon considerations that are not appropriate. Now, the City Council and other councils have done that before. When we've done it, those cases have been appealed to the district court, some on to the appellate court, others have been ultimately decided in the state Supreme Court. In each of those instances, under similar circumstances, the city of Shreveport has lost. Because you cannot deny someone the legal use of their property when it is properly zoned, it constitutes a use by right, and you're trying to engage in a process that could have some political motivations or could be an effort to try and predetermine a quarter before you have the legal authority begin to doing what they call quarter preservation. And some of those other instances, it's cost us several $100,000. This is one that could potentially cost the city of Shreveport millions. But those things are yet to be determined. Now, lastly, Lord, if I still have a little bit of time, since we're just about a half hour past, I want to talk to you all about the issue that is before the City Council still again today. And that is the issue of how it is that we managed to be able to go forward with the resolution of what some consider to be a controversy involving our financial advisor. You all heard from Mr. Grigsby several weeks ago, and I think that he brought to his presentation a level of passion and frustration that some may have difficulty understanding. Based on my experiences, while I may not agree with the way some things are expressed, I certainly understand the frustration because you are dealing with an individual who has done nothing but help and assist the city of Shreveport. Now, I became mayor in November of 2006. During this time frame 8 years ago, as we were leading up to that election, you heard my opponent and others across this city talk about the debt challenges facing the city. That we were on the verge of bankruptcy, that we had $1 billion in debt, that the charge card had been taken all the way up to the max, and that we were about to keel over and become the next Detroit. Well, my view on that was, I know we've got some issues and challenges. Once I get into the mayor's office, I'll be able to do a complete assessment. We'll see where we are, and we'll go from there. Well, it turns out, what the $1 billion in debt was about $650 million. About $500 million of that was wound up into the municipal finance version of an adjustable rate mortgage. For those of you who had adjustable rate mortgages on your home, you know that's one that can be one interest rate when you get it, and based upon the conditions of the mortgage contract can end up adjusting quite dramatically on it. To give you an example, I think that you heard reference, when I came into the mayor's office, the interest rate on the $40 million worth of revenue bonds for the Hilton Hotel, the monthly debt service on that rather, for that $40 million worth of bonds was $150,000. That debt service adjusted over the period of 2 months and went from $150,000 per month to $450,000. That was because the interest rate went from 4% to 12%. Now, we had more credit default swaps per capita than any other city in the United States of America. And credit default swaps were largely unregulated. did not have to have the approval and the authority of the State Bond Commission, did not have the proper oversight of the SEC or FINRA or any of the other regulatory entities. They also financially were substantially more lucrative than doing traditional ways of financing. Mr. Grigsby gives the example. On that $40 million, the financial advisor and other folks would be in line for fees somewhere around $40,000 or so per. With a credit default swap, you not only get those fees, but you also get a $400,000 swap fee that doesn't have to be approved or authorized by the State Bond Commission, isn't overseen by the SEC, and still ends up being owed and paid for by the city of Shreveport and added into the overall debt. And so obviously from a financial reward standpoint, those were obviously more lucrative transactions to engage in. Under some circumstances, they also could potentially provide significant benefit to the city as well in terms of how it was financed. In this particular case, it all began to work against the city of Shreveport. Essentially, we had a series of ticking time bombs waiting to go off on us here. Mr. Grigsby was the only one of the 5 entities that we interviewed regarding financial services for the city of Shreveport that identified, and this is prior to the start of all of the financial crisis that you saw taking place around the rest of the country, that eventually happened in the housing sector and what have you. This is still months prior to that. He identified for us and said, you have a problem. And here's how that problem is going to end up impacting the city of Shreveport. You can imagine your own household or business debt. If you had notes that tripled in the span of a couple of months, your house note, your car note, your utility payments, your equipment financing and whatever, if all of those things began to double and quadruple and triple over the time span of months and your cash flow, your revenue stayed the same, then you do end up in bankruptcy. And so it was Mr. Grigsby who stepped in conjunction with the former council and our staff, Tom Dark at the time, Liz Washington, Charles Madden, Dale Sibley, and put in place the measures that helped to extricate us from those challenges. Put us in a position to be able to go forward to the citizens and begin to talk about the need for addressing some of our infrastructure challenges. Put us in a position to be able to put forward to them the largest bond proposal in the history of the city of Shreveport. Put us in a position to be able to effectively put out a line of thought and a line of reasoning contrary to what was being espoused by the well-funded folks in the Tea Party that said that we should not do that. Voters responded positively by an average of 60% and approved all 3 measures. We in turn went to the markets, to the rating agencies, presented our case, ended up having the city's A+ bond rating positively affirmed when you had other cities that were having their credit ratings downgraded. We had our A+ rating strongly affirmed. We had our management practices, the way in which we do business at the city of Shreveport, upgraded from standard to good based upon the changes that we had put in place. We also ended up receiving the lowest interest rate received by any public entity in the state of Louisiana for 2011, a 3.9% interest rate. Despite that there were some on the council and others in the community who wanted us to go and negotiate that interest rate with some of the local lenders, which would have given them a chance to be able to ultimately end up giving us a higher interest rate. We also ended up having all that done for the lowest amount of fees in terms of professional fees, financial advisory fees, bond counsel fees, 0.2% of 1%. Am I correct? 0.2% of 1% in total fees. The lowest interest rate for the year and the lowest cost for the year. But now, from the minds of some, something was wrong with that still. You fast forward, after we end up passing that bond proposal, after we end up going to New York to finance the debt, we come forward with an idea that the city of Shreveport needs to also do more with regard to fixing our streets. Because despite the fact that we passed the largest bond proposal ever in the history of the city of Shreveport, $175 million only 21 million of that 175 ended up being undedicated street money. Having been a former city council member, I know how a council member mind works. You look at a sum of money that's undedicated, you say there's 7 of us, we're going to divide it 7 ways. $3 million per district, that's exactly what ended up happening. And so what you end up with is a situation where you have very large, high-need districts that have very little money, and you have some smaller, more compact, lower-need districts that essentially have more money than what they probably need for some of the challenges and problems that they have. Reference District C, where Carroll Street is being reconstructed to the tune of almost $1 million. If you were to take Carroll Street and put it in the middle of District A, District B, District G, or District F, it would be considered one of the best streets in the district. But still, because that council member had those dollars allocated and approved to them, had to find somewhere to spend it, that's where he spent it. I held that process up for review so that we could go in and document the condition of some of the streets that were recommended for repair and upgrade by various council members. Had the contractor of those projects that came down and complained to the council. Now, what he ended up doing was explaining very specifically exactly what the problem was. He said, Mayor, you're holding up Carroll Street. Carroll Street really does need some work. So what you should have been doing is doing the same thing when I was doing West Wilderness. Because West Wilderness really didn't need to work at all. And I said, well, you have just made the point that I'm trying to establish, and that is that while we have some areas of the city that have streets that are in absolutely abysmal condition, that are simply crumbling and falling apart, we also have some areas where council members are spending dollars on streets that are in relatively good condition because they have those dollars that have been allocated to them by this just simply let's split it up 3 equal ways. So recognizing that as the problem and the challenge, we came forward with a strategy that said, let's increase our franchise fees on our utility bills to the same level as everybody else within the SWEPCO service district. Everybody else besides the city of Shreveport that SWEPCO serves, and that's including Northwest Louisiana, over into East Texas, that already had their franchise fees increased to 5%. City of Shreveport was still at 2%. We were essentially helping to pay because SWEPCO spreads that charge anyway throughout the entirety of the service area. We were already paying as Shreveporters for the additional revenue that was going to Bossier and other cities and municipalities across the region. So we increased ours from 2 to 5% as well. What that resulted in was an additional $6 million in revenue coming to the city of Shreveport. It was my suggestion that we take that $6 million and that we go out to the bond market and we leverage it to borrow an additional amount of money to come back and do a large portion of street work across the city. Leveraging those dollars would have given us close to $100 million, the largest single sum of dollars for street work ever in the history of Shreveport. We would have been able to do some of the major corridors across this city, like the Linwoods, the Jewellas, the Hollywoods, the Piermonts. We also would have been able to go into the neighborhoods and do a lot of the collector streets within the neighborhoods that are in horrible condition. And we would have been able to address some of the worst neighborhood streets in this city as well. It would have been work that would have gone all across the city. Well, as was reported on Marion Marks's blog, the stated purpose of the Fix Shreveport Streets Now effort was not to fix the streets. In fact, as was stated in that blog entry, that the streets aren't really in that bad a condition. That Glover's real motivation is to engage in another bond transaction so that his good friend and buddy, Calvin Grigsby, would be able to do more business with the city. The assumption being that Grigsby doing more business with the city somehow results in me being benefited in some way. As a result of that, leadership of the council at that time, Oliver Jenkins was the chairman, initiated an internal audit of the Grigsby contract. That process was led by Lennis Graham. Lennis and her staff engaged in that and found no wrongdoing whatsoever. There were some management issues, some oversight issues that needed to be dealt with, but no laws were broken. Nothing was done illegally, inappropriately, or unethically. That, unfortunately, was not enough for our council. They exercise, they have the right to do, their external investigation authority. set a budget for $75,000, hired an out-of-town law firm from Lafayette that has some serious Republican political leanings, brought them in to do an investigation that ultimately ended up costing the city of Shreveport over $100,000. That particular investigation raised questions, and I put up that parenthetically, raised questions about $677,000 worth of expenditure. We took advantage of the opportunity between the administration and Mr. Grigsby to respond to each and every one of those allegations. We answered them sufficiently and effectively enough that the council, through I believe it's resolution 120 of last year, acknowledged that none of those represented anything in terms of theft, inappropriate charges, or anything else that could not be effectively supported and documented. As a result, they went back to one of the questions that was asked in the audit that was done by Linus Graham and her staff, was whether or not the 3 actual bond propositions, as called for by the State Bond Commission, has done so under these types of conditions and circumstances, should have been billed as 3 propositions or as 1. Because they had gone through their internal audit and came up with nothing, because they had done the external investigation and came up with nothing, it's my perspective that I think that their council staff, the city attorney that's assigned to their office, felt they need to help them come up with something they could hang their hat on, and said that the difference between the cost of 1 transaction compared to 3 transactions was $53,000. And since Mr. Grigsby had been compensated for 3 transactions as opposed to 1, then the city of Shreveport was due $53,000. Now, mind you, this is after the State Bond Commission, and we'll have a chance to be able to detail this for you this afternoon, and we'll certainly encourage you to come out for the public hearing. This is after the State Bond Commission had already indicated 3 transactions and had authorized charges up to $255,000. Am I speaking correctly, Sharika? Up to $250,000. And so the actual bill that the city of Shreveport got was for over $100,000 less than what John Kennedy in the state bond office, the state treasurer's office, had already authorized. And so Mr. Grigsby, in an effort to try and resolve this issue, suggested, why don't we do this by arbitration? I guess we came to it as a mutual suggestion to each other. Let's resolve this by binding arbitration. In November of last year, Mr. Grigsby had deposited into Capital One, downtown, here in Shreveport, Louisiana, $50,500. I believe it was the 11th of November, as a precursor to our efforts to introduce before the council a resolution that will allow us to be able to, 1, engage in binding arbitration, and 2, go forward with the next bond sale, as well as the other things that we need to be doing now with regard to our water and our sewer infrastructure, now that we signed the consent decree with the Environmental Protection Agency and the Department of Justice. Council voted that measure down 1 vote to 6. We brought that effort back just a couple of weeks ago, attempted to introduce it yet again, got 3 votes this time with 4 against. In the meantime, in an effort to try and still resolve the situation, Mr. Grigsby still said, let's leave the money there and let's see if we can't come up with some kind of negotiated process with the council. The council's counsel, being John Frazier. Mr. Frazier informed Mr. Grigsby, I've been directed not to negotiate with you, despite the fact I think I'm the only one as mayor who has the authority to be able to direct the actions of any of the city attorneys or assistant city attorneys. Mr. Frazier informed Mr. Grigsby that I've been informed not to negotiate with you, but to file suit.
My God.
Now, under what circumstances would any of us who have a conflict with someone, and that person that we have a conflict with has offered to take the dollars in question, place them into an account. Now, in order for it to actually become an escrow account, we have to agree as the aggrieved party to also place our name on the account.
Right.
And state that we will engage in a process to resolve this dispute in this fashion.
Right.
That's what makes it actually at that point an escrow account.
Right.
That actually has the city of Shreveport as a party to it.
Yeah.
Rather than do that, we're dealing with a group of folks who said no. We're going to go through the time, the effort, the expense, the trouble, the bother of a lawsuit. Now, that lets me know that trying to resolve these matters is not what is the intent or the interest of some parties involved. That the effort to try and convolute, tie up, and bog all this down is really what's at the core. And as essentially as I had to come to the conclusion of, I guess especially after seeing one of our good friends, Cynthia Keith, with the Dog Park Alliance, when they held their celebration party. I didn't bring that poster with me this morning. They did a poster, a sign that was kind of an image of me, rather large size, not quite as large as I am now, I guess, a little bit larger maybe than I am now. And it had my image on it, and it had prisoner
Sure did.
written across the front with a prison number.
Wow.
And it dawned on me that apparently what's happened is that the assumption is that I'm a criminal and that I've attempted to steal from the city of Shreveport. That is what is motivating, what motivated the internal audit. That's what motivated the external investigation, and that the intent was to somehow come up with some version of a smoking gun that says, here is what Cedric has been doing to enrich himself since he has been mayor of the city of Shreveport. When that ultimately did not come out to be the truth, the last thing apparently that can be held and stood upon is this issue of whether or not it's one transaction or three transactions. And we're going to use that as a means of disqualifying Mr. Grigsby and forcing the mayor to use someone else. And stating as the reason why is that we have an ordinance in place that says that you cannot do business with anyone that has been deemed to owe money to the city of Shreveport. Well, the truth of the matter is that that ordinance is written with provisions that allow it to be waived. It has been waived as recently as last year. In fact, there are some individuals who would not be able to even get their paychecks. Thank you, Stephen. There are some individuals who would not be able to get their paychecks if that particular provision were strictly enforced. And so what the resolution that we have offered is, let's settle this matter of the quote-unquote stated debt that's owed, although it was approved payment that was approved by the city council, was approved by the city attorney's office, was approved by the city's finance department, was approved by the state treasurer's office and the bond commission, and I might add again, approved for a rate that was $102,000 or $3,000 more than what was actually charged. We now want to go back, revisit that issue, and not sell it through arbitration, but sell it through a lawsuit. I don't think we're dealing in good faith. It's hurting the citizens of this city. There are literally tens of millions of dollars that should have been unleashed to be done across this city, not just for parks, but for streets, for drainage, and other things that would be benefiting and enriching this city and putting people to work and giving us opportunity. And so we're here today to share that news with you. We will continue to share it with the citizens of this city. We have a public hearing that has been called for at the beginning of today's council meeting to give us a chance to be able to again share these facts. And we hope that ultimately what it will result in, since we picked up 3 votes to introduce the measure the last time, that we may have some members of the council that are willing to work with us. I told them, I don't believe we should spend $300,000 of taxpayer money on a dog park. Had we built it where they wanted to build it, it would have cost us over $1 million.
Right.
But in an effort to move the city forward, I compromised. Did what I thought was best to allow us to be able to move this issue forward. Because as important as all the other issues that we have in this city are, as long as the dog park was still before us, people like Marion, our good friends from Channel 3, find that to be much more interesting and much more compelling news than the real problems that this city faces. And so every newscast, every newspaper headline was going to continue to lead with issues of the dog park while the people of this city suffer. Now, to show you the good faith in which we have dealt with the dog park folks, Wednesday 28th, is that Wednesday?
Yes.
Tomorrow,
Tomorrow.
the Architect and Engineer Selection Committee will meet to review submissions to select a design team for the dog park. A dog park that only 7 people in the city of Shreveport voted for. 7. There's not a person in this room who voted for the dog park. There are tens of thousands of you who voted for all 3 of these bond propositions. That work is being held up because 7 people have decided to file a lawsuit, chase down allegations of wrongdoing that 1, have no substance in truth or reality, and that 3, they refuse to give up on, compromise, and go forward. And so thank you all for the opportunity to be able to be here today. It's almost 9 o'clock. I can be here as long as you need. I'll take direction from Craig and from
Let's
Lloyd.
get a mayor a big hand for coming out there. Take a few questions. Like I said, we're close to 9, but we want to get some questions in. I think Craig going to kick out and come to Mary and then Lester.
Well, first out, Mayor, thanks for coming out. I got a call from Lloyd that our good colleague, Attorney Saddle, was going to write this article